After Stellantis chooses Illinois workers over Ontario's, Donald Trump celebrates and Doug Ford fumes.
On this Wednesday night, Stellantis shifting gears. The auto giant moves some production from Canada to the U.S., leaving thousands of jobs on the line.
Devastating news for thousands of auto workers. Word that production of a vehicle set to be made in Brampton will be moved to Illinois.
Stellantis had temporarily paused work in the midst of the tariff war between Canada and the U.S., and now the company says the Jeep Compass will be built south of the border.
When Stellantis confirmed it was moving production from Brampton to Illinois, the reaction was instant. What Canada Industry Minister Melanie say?
Well, let me be clear on Stellantis. I'm extremely disappointed about this decision, and not only am I disappointed, it's completely unacceptable. So we will fight for these jobs. We will fight for the jobs at Brampton. We'll fight for the jobs that were committed by Stellantis, and we will fight for our auto sector.
3,000 workers were out of jobs. Local leaders called it a betrayal. Ontario's premier called it a stab in the back. News outlets painted it as the end of Canada's auto belt. Everyone expected protests, maybe even lawsuits, but Ottawa didn't lash out. Behind the scenes, it was preparing something else. Not anger, but a strategy. Instead of headlines, officials focused on contracts and clauses that could hold Stellantis accountable. They were turning frustration into leverage, using law and policy as quiet weapons. Because if they couldn't stop the move, they could still control the outcome. Was this really the end of Canadian manufacturing, or the start of something completely new? In early 2023, Stellantis confirmed what many in Ontario feared. The company was moving Jeep Compass production out of Canada and into Belvedere, Illinois. That decision meant roughly 3,000 jobs in Brampton were suddenly at risk. For years, the Brampton assembly plant had been one of Stellantis' key facilities in Canada. It built thousands of vehicles and supported entire local communities. But when U.S. tariffs on foreign-made cars increased, Stellantis shifted its focus south. The move was part of a $13 billion plan to expand operations in the United States and create more than 5,000 American jobs. In Canada, the reaction was immediate. Workers called the move disrespectful. Local leaders called it a betrayal. Ontario Premier Doug Ford accused Washington of stabbing Canadian industry in the back. For many, it felt like the beginning of the end for Ontario's once-strong auto belt. National headlines focused on the fallout, the layoffs, the lost production, and the threat to Canada's automotive supply chain. Union leaders warned that if Brampton fell, other Canadian plants could be next. Even federal officials admitted the news came as a shock. But while the public reaction was emotional, Ottawa's response was quiet and strategic. Instead of launching a political fight, government officials reviewed contracts, funding agreements, and investment commitments Stellantis had already signed. They wanted to know exactly how to hold the company accountable. That behind-the-scenes move would become the turning point. What started as a loss would soon evolve into a completely new industrial strategy, one that could reshape how Canada competes in the electric vehicle era. The question was simple: could Canada turn a corporate pullout into the foundation for something bigger? When Stellantis made the official announcement, it confirmed everyone's worst fear. The Jeep Compass, once built in Brampton, would now be produced in Belvedere, Illinois. The statement was short, but its impact was massive. Overnight, more than 3,000 Canadian workers were left uncertain about their future. The company said the move was part of a larger plan to modernize production and strengthen its North American operations, but most people saw it as a direct result of U.S. trade pressure. Washington's 25% tariff on imported vehicles had made it cheaper for Stellantis to shift work across the border. The news spread fast. Within days, television crews were outside the Brampton plant. Workers stood near the gates, some angry, others just stunned. For many families, this plant had been their main source of income for decades. Unifor, the union representing the workers, called the decision shocking and unacceptable. They argued that Stellantis had broken promises made when Canada invested millions into plant retooling. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said the company had turned its back on Canadian industry. Federal officials echoed that frustration, saying Stellantis had obligations tied to public funding. Meanwhile, local communities braced for impact. Small businesses around the plant feared fewer customers. Economists warned the closure could ripple across Ontario's auto sector, affecting suppliers and service jobs. Still, amid the anger, one detail stood out. Ottawa wasn't rushing to retaliate. There were no tariff threats, no loud press conferences. Instead, government officials started working quietly with legal teams. They wanted to review every clause of Stellantis' agreement. agreement, especially the ones tied to Canadian investments and job guarantees. Publicly, it looked like Canada had lost, but behind the scenes, a very different strategy was already forming. The backlash hit almost instantly. Across Ontario, headlines blasted Stellantis for walking away from its promise. Union leaders demanded accountability. Local mayors called the move a betrayal. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said Washington's tariffs had stabbed Canada in the back. News channels ran clips of angry workers outside the Brampton plant. For them, it wasn't just about losing jobs, it was about trust, a feeling that Canada's manufacturing heartland was being abandoned. Some even warned the entire auto belt could collapse if this continued. In Ottawa, the tone was different. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly expressed disappointment but avoided open confrontation. She called the decision completely unacceptable and promised that the federal government would hold Stellantis to account. Still, her words weren't shouted, they were measured. Behind closed doors, the federal team began reviewing contracts and funding deals tied to the company. They discovered that Stellantis had accepted millions in government support for plant upgrades, with clear conditions. If the company failed to produce vehicles in Canada, it could trigger a default by agreement clause, allowing the government to demand compensation or replacement investments. That discovery changed everything. Instead of fighting through the media, Ottawa decided to use the law. Every grant, every incentive, every funding promise would now have strings attached. It wasn't a protest, it was a plan. While public anger kept building, government lawyers and industry advisors quietly mapped out a counterattack. Their goal wasn't revenge, it was leverage. They wanted Stellantis to stay in Canada or pay for leaving, and that quiet legal strategy would soon turn what looked like a national defeat into the start of a major industrial comeback. While most people focused on the layoffs, Ottawa was already playing a different game. Instead of reacting with emotion, government officials used contracts, funding rules, and policy leverage to fight back. They started by reviewing every agreement Stellantis had signed when it accepted public funding. That included millions of dollars meant to help retool the Brampton plant for new vehicle production. Hidden inside those agreements were clauses that now became critical, especially one called the default by agreement clause. This clause gave Canada legal grounds to demand compensation if Stellantis failed to meet its production promises. In simple terms, it meant if the company pulled out without replacing the lost work, Ottawa could take action. That small legal detail turned into a powerful weapon. It shifted the story from Canada loses jobs to Canada demands accountability. Federal and provincial officials began using this approach not just with Stellantis, but with other automakers too. Any company that wanted Canadian support had to agree to firm production targets, local job creation, and commitments to invest in clean energy manufacturing. It was a quiet but bold move. Canada wasn't threatening anyone publicly, it was rewriting the rules privately. Every new contract became a roadmap to protect Canadian workers. This legal and policy shift showed something important. Ottawa had learned from past losses. Instead of competing with the US through emotion or politics, Canada used structure and precision. It was the beginning of a new industrial strategy, one that would soon lead to one of the biggest EV investments in Canadian history. The plan was already in motion, and the next move would catch everyone off guard. Out of that quiet legal fight came something no one expected, a new beginning. In 2023, Stellantis and LG Energy Solution announced a joint venture called NextStar Energy. It would be the largest electric vehicle battery plant in Canadian history, built in Windsor, Ontario. The investment was massive, over $5 billion. The plant was designed to produce more than 45 gigawatt hours of battery capacity each year, enough to power nearly 500,000 electric vehicles. It wasn't just a replacement for Brampton's lost jobs. It was a complete transformation of Canada's role in the global auto industry. For Windsor, this meant rebirth. The city had struggled for years after job losses in traditional auto manufacturing. Suddenly, it became the center of Canada's clean energy future. Thousands of construction workers poured into the site, and new suppliers began setting up nearby. By early 2024, the first parts of the plant were ready. The complex, called NextStar Energy, represented a shift from old-style assembly lines to high-tech innovation. Instead of shipping cars south, Canada would now export the batteries that powered them. The message was clear. Canada wasn't just chasing the electric vehicle revolution, it was building the foundation for it. Government officials called the project a turning point. The partnership showed that Canada could compete globally without losing control of its industry. industry. It was proof that careful planning and strategic policy could beat panic and politics. What started as a factory closure had evolved into a national statement that Canada could lead in the new energy economy. But the battle wasn't over yet. The United States had just passed its Inflation Reduction Act, offering huge subsidies to EV manufacturers. And soon, Stellantis would test just how far Ottawa was willing to go to stay competitive. Just as construction on the NextStar battery plant began, a new challenge appeared. In the US, President Joe Biden introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, a massive plan offering billions in subsidies for clean energy and electric vehicles. It gave automakers huge tax credits to build inside the United States. For companies like Stellantis, the message was simple: build in America and you'll get paid to stay. That created a serious problem for Canada. If the US was paying more, what would stop automakers from moving all their projects south? Stellantis quickly took notice. In 2023, the company paused construction at the Windsor battery plant and told Ottawa it wanted the same level of support offered by the US government. Without that, it warned, production could be delayed or moved elsewhere. Behind the scenes, it turned into a high-stakes negotiation. Canada's federal government and Ontario's provincial leaders worked around the clock to find a solution. Matching the US offer would cost billions, but letting the project collapse would be far worse. After tense weeks, Ottawa made its move. Canada agreed to provide about $12.2 billion in federal incentives, plus over $5 billion from Ontario and another $1 billion for construction support. A total package close to $15 billion over 10 years. Analysts called it strategic parity. Canada had matched the US deal dollar for dollar. Stellantis resumed construction, and the NextStar project was officially back on track. The message was clear: Canada wasn't backing down. If the US wanted an EV race, Ottawa was ready to compete head-on. But this wasn't just about one company anymore. Canada's move would trigger something much bigger, a wave of new investments that would change the entire region. Once the deal with Stellantis was locked in, the results came fast. The Windsor area, once hit hard by auto job losses, began turning into something completely new: Battery Valley. The NextStar energy plant became the anchor for an entire ecosystem of clean tech manufacturing. Suppliers from around the world started moving in. South Korea's DS Actimo announced a $60 million investment to build its first North American facility nearby. Local construction companies were booked for years. Within months, the region added over 2,000 new jobs, not just in the plant itself, but across logistics, materials, and research. By late 2025, more than 1,000 full-time employees were already working at NextStar, with thousands more expected as production ramps up. Windsor and Essex County offered generous deals to attract even more partners, long-term land leases, and up to 20 years of property tax relief for green manufacturers. These incentives helped turn a once struggling auto town into the center of Canada's EV industry. Economists began to take notice. Reports predicted that Windsor's local economy would grow nearly 3% per year between 2025 and 2028, one of the fastest rates in the country. Even better, the new EV supply chain started spreading benefits beyond Ontario, with companies in Quebec and British Columbia joining the network. Canada wasn't just reacting anymore, it was leading. Exports of battery materials and components to Europe and Asia jumped sharply. Countries looking for clean, stable suppliers began turning to Canada instead of relying on China or the US. What began as a job crisis had turned into a blueprint for renewal. But even with all the success, one question still lingered: was this a real comeback, or just the beginning of another global competition? Canada's fight to keep Stellantis wasn't loud, it was smart. While some countries used threats or tariffs, Ottawa used planning, contracts, and timing. Instead of chasing headlines, it built leverage. The result proved something big. Economic power doesn't always need noise. It can come from calm strategy and clear goals. When the US rolled out its Inflation Reduction Act, offering billions in subsidies for clean energy, Canada didn't panic. It matched the deal, dollar for dollar. The government offered $15 billion in support over 10 years to keep battery jobs and technology at home. That single move showed global investors that Canada could compete and win on fair terms. By 2025, automakers had invested more than $46 billion into Canada's EV supply chain. The country was no longer just building cars, it was building the technology that powered them. Battery cells, energy storage, and clean manufacturing became the new pillars of its economy. The US struggled with rising costs and changing policies, but Canada moved in the opposite direction. Steady, patient, focused. Trade with Europe and Asia grew fast as Ottawa branded branded itself as a trusted democratic supplier of clean energy materials. The story of Stellantis moving production might have started as bad news, but it ended as proof that Canada could turn a setback into an advantage. This wasn't just a recovery, it was a reinvention, a quiet one, built not on anger, but on design. So now the question is simple. Did Canada just save its auto industry? Or did it quietly build the blueprint for a new kind of industrial future? Stellantis' move once looked like a loss, but Canada turned it into momentum. Through calm decisions and strong strategy, it didn't just save jobs, it built the foundation for a cleaner, smarter economy. Windsor's Battery Valley is proof that quiet planning can win louder than politics ever could. As global industries race toward electric futures, Canada isn't chasing anymore, it's leading. Quietly, confidently, and with purpose. What do you think? Is this Canada's new industrial era, or just the start of something even bigger?